Hi, I'm Dr. Paula Redmond, a clinical psychologist, and you're listening to the When Work Hurts podcast. On this show, I want to explore the stories behind the statistics of the mental health crisis facing healthcare professionals today, and to provide hope for a way out through compassion, connection, and creativity. Join me as I talk to inspiring clinicians and thought leaders in healthcare about their unique insights and learn how we can support ourselves and each other when work hurts. My guest this week is Megan Tjasink, Head Art Psychotherapist in Cancer and Palliative Services at Barts Health NHS Trust in London. We talk about her work with doctors and how art therapy and creative practice can help in coping with burnout. I began by asking Megan about her role.
I'm the lead art psychotherapist in cancer and palliative care at Barts Hospital within the Barts Health NHS Trust. I have, however, recently been seconded to QMUL just this last month, where I'm doing a PhD, which is supported by the Barts charity. And the research is specifically about using art therapy to address symptoms of anxiety and burnout in hospital-based healthcare professionals.
For many of us, we won't be that familiar with art therapy and how it might be used in these contexts. Maybe you could explain how you use art therapy with health professionals and why.
At our hospital, which is an acute hospital working well with the kind of cancer centre, a heart centre and endocrine are the main kind of clinical areas at Barts Hospital. So we work with physical health, and I sit within Cancer Psychological Services, which consists of art psychotherapy and clinical psychology. We work very closely with the MDTs, the multidisciplinary teams, who care for the kind of physical health and also some of the kind of mental health of our patients. We have a lot invested in those relationships with healthcare workers on a professional level in terms of joined up patient care. So we run things like clinical discussion groups. We do lots of kind of psychoeducation and trainings and contribute to the MDTs. However, kind of support for healthcare professionals kind of beyond those normal sort of working professional roles, it has been recognised more recently and during the pandemic that is something that is very important. However, with the art therapy within the hospital, I'd say we've been very kind of well placed to address some of those needs. And so have been doing so for some while, although the kind of that shifted and kind of developed further during the first lockdown in 2020. It started a bit, I think it was about 8 years ago. I was going up to one of our cancer wards to see a patient for an art therapy session at the bedside, and I was carrying my box of art materials and it's quite noticeable, perhaps, kind of not many professionals lug around kind of boxes of paints and so on onto the ward. And there were some medical oncology registrars at the kind of ward reception desk who kind of saw me with these materials and they're like, "Oh, can't we have art therapy?" And I thought they were sort of just joking. And started chatting to them, and they were like, "No, really, we're really
please."
There'd been a series of deaths on the ward, and kind of young patients who kind of treatment hadn't been successful for, quite sad cases, and these doctors were really struggling. I didn't commit to anything at the time and kind of went away, and a few days later met another of their cohort who I hadn't originally kind of had the conversation with in a lift. And once again, I was carrying a box of art materials, and he read my badge, which said art psychotherapist, and he's like, "Oh, what's that? And this looks interesting." And we started talking and decided, okay, we had a few kind of meetings and decided to see whether we could create a model, a kind of feasible structure in which we could bring art therapy or art therapy based workshops to this particular cohort of oncology registrars. So I guess from the kind of outset, it was really important to have a collaborator who was, one of the, I guess, the physicians, or, one of the healthcare workers I was wanting to work with. So that, I guess, that was the kind of the start. And there's Jahan Susai Pillai, who the doctor at the time, who I started collaborating with, and we've subsequently published a paper about the pilot to using art therapy to address burnout in oncology and palliative care registrars. That grew out of this initial meeting, sort of in the lift, and then thinking about, well, how can we make this happen? There was a lot of thought that went into kind of structuring this program, and Jahan's input was invaluable in terms of us making it sort of realistic and, I guess, kind of acceptable to the doctors in terms of how they could fit it in, and so that they would actually be able to attend. So those kind of practicalities were essential for enabling the intervention to be a success. And then one of the psychologists I worked with, one of the clinical psychologists, had done some work in Hong Kong, and he said, "Oh, there's this art therapist I worked with, Jordan Potash, who is doing work with end-of-life healthcare workers using art therapy in Hong Kong." And so I got in touch with him, and he was developing this model using art therapy-based methods for supervision for end-of-life workers. And so his work really kind of, and he was very supportive and interested, and so that really helped me to see, okay, there's already a framework developing here. I don't have to sort of make everything from scratch to develop a kind of 6-week intervention. And so, thought, well, we're doing this, may as well do it as a pilot, and use the Maslach burnout inventory, which is the kind of gold standard measure for burnout, kind of before and after, as well as some qualitative questionnaire, and found actually that this intervention was remarkably impactful, and the feedback was really, really positive. Doctors who had originally been kind of quite skeptical about art, it's like, oh, I can't draw, kind of found themselves actually, after a stressful day at work, kind of drawing at home as a way of unwinding. So it's something that they sort of unexpectedly gained and took from the experience.
And how did you sell it to the department, to management? How did you get buy-in for it?
Well, initially, I wasn't really able to sell it to the department or to management. So this was just something that the doctors and I did, and we did it after working hours because they couldn't get time out during the day. So we did it after clinics. We ran it from, I think it was 6:30 to 8 at night. But then, from this initial series of sessions, I had the outcomes measures, and kind of, it was a very small sample set at that point, but even then we could see there was real potential and statistically significant kind of shifts on 2 out of 3 of the items on the Maslach burnout inventory, and positive shifts across all 3. And also the feedback was so positive that I was then able to go to the doctors, they have the kind of a clinical audit meeting kind of quite regularly, and go to that kind of forum and do a presentation, and be able to show the difference that it made, and have these sort of testimonials. And also something that I think is hugely helpful is having amazing artwork that people have produced, because it's just so different to what the clinicians will be looking at in these types of audit meetings. And it's like they really wake up, it's like, oh, that's interesting, and kind of take note. And so presenting to clinicians, making presentations to management, and so on. And so that first step, where we were sort of very much on our own in a way, really helped then to kind of, okay, now we got some evidence, and this is actually working. And then I got some funding after that from the Bart charity, that helped to kind of free me up from a little bit of the kind of patient load or the clinical work, in order to develop it further. So then ran the pilot over a kind of another 3 years with subsequent cohorts.
Can you tell us, Megan, about what kind of work you were doing in the group? What sort of projects, what sort of work was going on?
All of the workshops were structured with kind of particular themes. So, which is a little bit different to the way you would generally kind of do art therapy with, or use art therapy with patient groups. And so the themes were kind of the first 2 weeks were on the theme about the kind of the self and self-awareness, and the self, sort of how you bring yourself to your professional role. And then the kind of middle 2 weeks were about the team, the kind of collegial connection, and those kind of sessions involved making together. So kind of group, making kind of group sculptures with clay, painting exercises where the kind of page is shared and different people kind of work on the painting to resolve issues for each other. And the final 2 sessions were about kind of meaning in terms of patient relationships, and also death and bereavement in relation to patients who had died. And in those sessions, there was quite a strong element of kind of mindfulness and compassion focused kind of therapy influenced, I would say, the sort of last 4 sessions in the series. But yeah, so a sort of range of art materials available. What was really important was having kind of tea and coffee and some biscuits available when people arrived, because often they hadn't had time to eat during the day. The vending machines are appalling. So, people are kind of living on vending machine food. And then a kind of checking in, anything kind of left over from the week before, or just general kind of checking in. And then we'd move into kind of art making on whatever the particular theme was. So a range of art materials kind of available to select from. And having the art making at the start of the session in that way was really important, because I think this particular group kind of doctors tend to be very kind of cerebral and use a lot of sort of top-down processing in terms of how they kind of solve problems within their work environment and kind of approach things. And so by encouraging the use of art materials at the start of the session, it really helped to kind of shift people into a different space and a different kind of, it's almost a sort of relief, a kind of to get out of your head and into your body. So quite a focus on the sort of tactile qualities of the materials, kind of noticing how they feel, touch, and so on, to encourage a different type of processing. So the sort of more bottom-up processing. So really getting into that sort of body-mind aspect of art therapy, I guess. And with this particular group with healthcare professionals, I think that's really, really important, because they're very kind of skilled and kind of well practiced at solving problems, but then some things get stuck, and so being able to kind of use a different way of approaching problems, this sort of bottom-up processing, I think was quite key actually to why these sessions were helpful for people, and also enabling them to feel renewed, because it's sort of you're able to rest one side of the brain to a certain degree and kind of nourish another part of yourself that is perhaps a bit neglected. So there'd be the sort of art making followed by reflection. So group reflection, people kind of sharing and talking about the making, thoughts and feelings that have come up, this kind of group discussion. So that was a sort of, I guess, each session would involve checking in, making, and reflection, but the themes and materials would vary.
And Megan, you mentioned those three themes, though, the sort of self and identity, the kind of team relationships, and then something about meaning. And I was struck by those three themes that are often really core to when work hurts for many health professionals, in terms of struggles with identity often being so fused with the professional identity. And when relationships with colleagues are tricky, that can be so distressing. And also, I guess, particularly with the group you were working with, facing a lot of death, a lot of really hard relationships, painful stuff going on with patients. So I'm struck by the really kind of hard-hitting themes that the group was framed around. And I wonder what you needed to do to enable people to access that process, particularly with colleagues.
Yeah, so I think, that's really important. And, providing this type of intervention within a work setting, I think one has to be very experienced, and it has to be very kind of thoughtfully done, because you don't want to make people vulnerable with colleagues who they then have to work with. So creating safety is really important. So at the start, before people kind of opted into joining the group, there was a meeting in which kind of confidentiality, what would be expected of sort of respectful interactions, and also sort of how to keep oneself safe. So, not to overshare. Everyone knows their kind of limitations, but to be mindful of this is a work setting. So that's absolutely key. And also, what was quite key was in that initial session, kind of saying, well, this isn't therapy, and also called art therapy based workshops. So it's like, I'm not your therapist. This is not therapy. We are doing this as a way of trying to kind of engage with difficult themes in order to kind of nourish and enhance our kind of working lives and lives more generally. But the focus very much being on this is something that's happening within a work environment. And yeah, it takes kind of skillful conducting of the group. But also, these doctors are very high functioning individuals. So it's not like working with a sort of vulnerable patient group. They may be struggling with kind of stress and, all kinds of things, but they're not a particularly kind of vulnerable cohort. So put it that way. So sort of things are pitched at a certain level. And I think if the sessions had been talking alone, I don't think the doctors would have got to the point where they were able to share the way they did and the things they did about the patients, the sad moments, the difficult moments, how they felt when, treatment failed, or, patients that died, and difficult situations. And the thing about art therapy is it can be a really useful approach with highly defended people, because it's like a side door, and you can talk about your artwork. You don't have to talk about you. You can kind of use metaphor, and it's much less direct than talking alone. So there's a sort of indirect kind of route in. And also, because of this sort of body mind approach, you're accessing sort of feelings without necessarily the sort of gatekeeper being sort of as dominant as usually the kind of your mind would be. So sometimes you can access things in a softer or a gentler, kind of less direct way. but they can still be acknowledged. And even if they're acknowledged only by the artwork that has been made, been there and sort of been witnessed, or your own feelings or thoughts about it, they don't necessarily even have to be voiced. So there's different sort of levels, and some people would talk more than others, and then feel that they kind of felt better because other people had acknowledged difficulties, like, oh yeah, I thought I was alone in that. So they don't have to kind of blurt everything out. It's sort of that sort of sense of being in something together and also having something else to focus on. Having the art making, I think, really helped people to feel, um, yeah, just less sort of on the spot in terms of talking about difficult things.
Sounds like an ideal process to help people, as you say, kind of access and acknowledge and just kind of take a pause out of their busy lives to give room and give space to some of the difficult stuff they wrestle with and carry with them.
Yeah, I mean, that slowing down is essential. So the art making aspect slows things down. So during the art making, often there's no talking. So you have these extended, moments of silence. You might have 20 minutes of no one saying anything. And during the art making process, they're sort of focusing on what they're making, but they're also reflecting. And that is so rare for these individuals to have that time and that space to slow down and reflect is something that very rarely happens. And so I think the art making really facilitates that. And to just have a silence if you weren't doing something, I think would feel quite uncomfortable. But to have that focus and you're doing something, but you don't have to be talking, I think is really helpful.
And I know in the paper that you published, Megan, there are examples of the artwork from some of the groups, which I found really profound to see. So there's something about a ripple effect of this work that I think people, even the viewing of art, can also have meaning.
Yes, absolutely. In March 2020, kind of right near the start of the sort of pandemic in the UK, I set up an online art therapy based kind of group for our clinicians, along with a blog called Coping Through Connection and Creativity. And the kind of output, so of what people kind of made in these sessions, we actually ended up having an exhibition of the artwork that staff had made. So some people, not everyone, but some people kind of really wanted to exhibit their work and were happy to. So within the hospital, we had an exhibition of the artwork with people's kind of little paragraph about their reflection about their piece or their experience of making it. And that was just, it was remarkable how other staff members who went to see the work, their kind of comments about it was such a relief, that someone else was feeling those same things, and to sort of view that in an artwork, I think gave it a different type of impact, or it resonated in a different way, kind of connected. People could kind of connect experiences. We also put my art therapist colleague and I put um, uh, artwork up in some of the clinical spaces where the kind of, for example, the corridor leading to the clinical nurse specialist office with artwork or photographs about sort of noticing the everyday that staff had kind of sent in to our blog. And these kind of posters that we put up, essentially sort of collages of different artworks and photographs people had sent in, became these sort of hubs of conversation. So people would stop and like talk to each other around these, and then start showing each other photographs on their phones that they had taken. And so they became a kind of way to connect within the, you know, sort of stop, reflect, connect, kind of share images, um, and feelings. So that kind of viewing and witnessing what is really important in terms of feeling connected. It doesn't have to be the making.
And I know there's some research that shows that viewing art has a physiological response that can support our nervous systems in terms of reducing blood pressure and heart rate and things.
Along with kind of the, you know, as you're saying about the positive impact of viewing art, there's been in the last 10 years a lot of development with art therapist researchers working with neuroscience to look at what actually happens in the brain when we use different art materials. So there's a researcher in the States called Juliet King and others who are doing really, really interesting work using kind of imaging of the brain and kind of scans and so on. So what happens when you use clay? What happens when you use, you know, these when you do colouring in? You know, all these kind of different ways of engaging with art materials. And that research is particularly in relation to work with veterans and trauma. But yeah, it's a kind of growing area, and it's really changing the way we understand what happens and why is art making helpful.
I know, Megan, you started this work before the pandemic when burnout rates were high, and then COVID came along. What happened for you and this work? I know you've mentioned this lovely exhibition and the blog, but what are your reflections looking back on these last couple of years and how that's impacted on your work?
It's helped a lot of sort of threads that I was already sort of working with to sort of come together and to be consolidated in a way. It certainly shifted my thinking and my understanding about sort of the role of art within the medical setting and within the hospital setting and with clinicians. And I think that happened through, you know, in the pandemic, there was a kind of, we had a real issue with people being kind of cut off. So from their normal support systems, you know, wearing PPE, cut off from their senses. You know, there was a real kind of disconnection on many levels. And of course, that leads to anxiety. And so I guess that sort of element of connection through creativity that had always been there just sort of came to the fore for me. It was like, oh, okay, you know, this is the focus now. So, for example, we're asked to run a workshop for the ICU nurses. It was sort of in the summer between the two waves, as a little kind of reprieve, and decided to use clay for that workshop because of wanting to sort of help people to kind of connect with their senses and to sort of get into the body. And, you know, I kind of brought all the gloves and the aprons and everything. We had to do all of the kind of PPE. And they didn't want to wear the gloves with the clay. I mean, we had other, you know, use hand gel and so on, but they wanted to sort of be in there and they wanted to sit on the floor. And we put this big sort of tarpaulin out on the floor and they were sitting together playing with this clay. And it was like, I mean, I guess sort of classic attachment theory. It's like it's children. It's like wanting to play and just like relishing the connection with this material and with each other through this sort of playful kind of, we're allowed to do something nice, you know, we can use clay and be playful. And then of course kind of I did a bit of a sort of mindfulness, so sort of breathing at the start and got people sort of into their bodies a bit and kind of noticing the feel of the clay and didn't give any directive in terms of what they needed to make or focus on. But it was just they needed to sort of initially work on their own and then kind of make something in smaller groups of sort of 3 or 4, a sort of group piece. And every single group made something about their experience of the pandemic. So one group made a clay COVID patient with kind of drop foot for being in ICU for too long, a distended belly, but then this huge heart, and kind of talking about how it was all worthwhile when, just those sort of moments of connection with a patient, like squeezing a hand or somebody being grateful or their relatives saying thank you, and kind of being able, it's sort of how that kept them going. Um, and those kind of themes just came out and throughout. And, they'd been working together in ICU all this time and they'd never spoken about their experiences. They just hadn't. And it's like, and and also I don't know whether that would have happened with once again without the kind of art making. I didn't say, you need to make about your experiences. Sort of knew that that would happen, but well, I thought it might, and yeah, it did because it needed to, but it was done in a way that was playful initially, and then moved into something that could be reflective and also talking about loss and kind of personal loss and professional loss and very sort of profound themes that came out, but were facilitated through being able to sort of play together, have that feeling of being connected, being safe. So yeah, I suppose it's just that realizing and thinking also from a sort of evolutionary perspective in terms of what happens when we become disconnected. We kind of feel unsafe and like all kinds of kind of problems result from us feeling that we are alone. And so just really kind of I think that was a shift for me during the pandemic is, okay, the main focus is on creating connection. So whether that's through connection with the art making process and the sort of self through that, or connection to others through the art making.
Gosh, that feels like such meaningful, profound work. And you mentioned that you're doing a PhD, or you've just started that process. And are you going to be extending this work through that?
PhD it's building on the pilot, so looking at burnout testing in a proper kind of RCT, which is a bit daunting, but I'm with the right people to help me with it. So yeah, a randomized controlled trial to test group art therapy model to address burnout, and as the primary endpoint is burnout with a focus on emotional exhaustion, and then the secondary endpoint will be anxiety. And then expanding beyond doctors to include other healthcare professionals, kind of hospital-based healthcare professionals who are primarily working directly with patients. So nurses, doctors, and AHPs.
So on top of my to-do list now is find an art therapy group near me. But I wondered, Megan, for those of us that, who may not have access to an art therapist, what your thoughts are about how we might be able to, use these ideas and techniques to support us in our everyday life.
Well, I think it's very easy to use a lot of these ideas and techniques in your everyday life, and you absolutely don't need to have, an art therapist to do that. I mean, there are a couple of things that come to mind. One is that, I mean, for my own kind of well-being, I think, it was really important for me during I think it was during the first lockdown, I kind of reconnected with an old friend, professor of drawing in South Carolina, Sarah Schneckloth. Because she got in touch, she was running these kind of online botanical and geological kind of drawing workshops, which I kind of joined. And she helped me to sort of, I suppose, engage with my own kind of creativity and be a bit playful, which was really important. And I learned a lot from her. in relation to sort of simple things that I could do for myself in terms of my own kind of art making. And so one of the things that she got us to do was to kind of, in preparation for the workshop, to go and collect botanical objects or subjects that had lots of kind of small removable parts. So like a frond, leaf frond with bits, or kind of a flower with petals. And then we came together and kind of explored with touch kind of what we had found, and did kind of slow looking, just noticing everything. What does the back of the plant look like, and the veins and the ridges and the imperfections? And then mindfully, I guess, always, I'm not sure that's the right word, but destroying the plant. So kind of systematically, like plucking every leaf or every petal and think, well, what does it feel like? Just noticing, does it come away easily? Does it kind of fight back? It's kind of the sound, the smell, everything of that experience. And then it's like, well, what does that feel like? It's like, oh, I've destroyed this beautiful plant. And it's quite mixed, and then creating something beautiful with that and being playful. So her big thing was that you don't have to have lots of art materials. She kind of, you go to your kitchen and use, all of these kind of products that you have at home, and to be playful in trying to sort of experiment with mark making in lots of sort of quick exercises. So, for example, kind of dipping the leaves in paint and then printing, or drawing around them, or just lots of different ways of kind of using them as a starting point, moving them around the page, the different kind of parts of the plant, kind of dropping them on, seeing where they land, and create a drawing out of that. So for me, kind of engaging with those kinds of art workshops that really embraced nature and playfulness, but in its sort of destructiveness as well as the kind of creation, or was just really helpful, and also really meaningful when you're kind of in a space where lots of things are broken or have been dismantled, and needing to sort of create a new reality. So there's lots of metaphor that can be found in quite kind of simple art making exercises. And the blog I mentioned earlier that created for clinicians at the hospital has a lot of examples. So the kind of workshops, the different weeks, there are different themes we put up. And then there's a gallery with kind of, people who kind of wanted to send in what they'd made. So they kind of, the interpretations of these themes by kind of nurses and psychologists and various kind of different health professionals who engaged. So that's a good place, I think, to go to look for examples. And it's called Bart's Art and Wellbeing, Coping Through Connection and Creativity. So there are a number of themes, some very much inspired by Sarah's botanical art workshops, and then taken with a bit more of a sort of art therapy slant, and others that are sort of from trauma-informed art therapy practice, such as there's a workshop on there called Create, Destroy, Transform. There are a number of different kind of examples, also including some sort of mindfulness practices, such as mindful walking, as a sort of precursor to some creative activity. So kind of weaving being outside in nature, but also kind of noticing and slow looking as part of the process.
And it strikes me, I guess, one of the things that I think comes up for lots of people, and certainly comes up for me, is some of the barriers or worries or anxieties when I hear the word art and art making, in terms of, particularly for me, I really struggle with perfectionism and, experiences of school, being graded on how good or bad your art is, and not quite being good enough. How do you kind of support people who might be struggling with those kind of worries about getting in touch with their creative side.
It's very important to acknowledge those kind of fears and even sort of biases, I guess, from the outset. And most people have those, it's sort of at some point in your life, and interestingly, very often around the age of sort of 8 or 9, you become either good or bad at art. And lots of people can remember the conversation. So whether it's with a teacher, they get a sort of bad result at school, or a parent, or, there'll be a moment where you move into either category. But before that, it's just a natural form of communication or expression. And with art therapy, it's very much about the process. So whether there's an end product or not, very often it doesn't even matter really. You could tear something up or throw it away, or, it's the sort of process that we focus on generally. Obviously, there's a kind of range of practice. I mean, this is, I think, an issue when referring patients to art therapy. Patients will often say, well, I'm not good at art. And in a way, actually, it's almost better if somebody is naive in relation to art, because they don't have these sort of ideals. Oh, I need to do a really good drawing. It's like, well, I don't even know where to start. So they're able to be sort of more spontaneous. So I have lots of conversations with referrers and also with patients about exactly this. And my take is really that art making, if you consider it, I suppose, from a more sort of anthropological perspective, as humans, I think it's just an innate one way that we communicate. And we've been using symbols, to express things and communicate with each other for as long as sort of humans have been around, or that we are aware of. And this sort of construct of sort of fine art that developed later, in lots of ways, is quite unhelpful for art therapists. It's not really about that. I mean, that has lots of value, and, aesthetics is another whole interesting area. But really, this is a way of kind of just a natural human form of expression. Meaning making. We use metaphor to solve problems. And in therapy, often that's what we're doing. People get stuck, and art making is very well kind of suited to problem solving, because you are using metaphor, kind of thinking in different ways in order to resolve something. So I guess that's kind of, I would tell somebody to sort of, that I'm not going to be judging their output. There doesn't even necessarily need to be an output. I'm much more interested in the process and sort of how they feel about the process, what that's like, kind of thinking about the materials as well, not just an end product. We're also not interested necessarily in something being representational. It could be completely abstract, or just pouring paint on paper, or thumping a piece of clay with your fist. I had a patient who made something that I just remember as a very powerful artwork, and she had been in clinic and had some bad news from her consultant about her cancer. And our art therapy session was kind of pre-planned, and it was kind of after the clinic time. And she came in and she was just too distraught to sort of make anything, and she just cried and cried and developed this kind of pile of tissues in front of her on the table. And she's like, oh, I haven't made anything, I just haven't been able to make anything today. And the sun was coming through the window, and this pile of tissues was this sort of beautiful sculpture with the sort of light through the tissue, and then the shadow it was creating. And, and I said, well, I think you have created something, and you've been able to kind of express, how you're feeling, and the kind of just the terrible sadness and the despair. You've created this incredibly eloquent piece. And then we decided we kind of thought about, what did she want to do? with her sculpture that she created with her distress. Um, did she want to throw them away? And in the end, she made a box and kept them in the box. And that was her piece that she'd made. And for me, that's one of the most profound sort of artworks. And I still remember lots of artworks, but it just really stands out. And it was just like this moment of connection as well, being able to sort of be with somebody and to just be sad. And that in itself was sort of valuable to share that and meaningful. And so, yeah, we're not necessarily looking for a landscape or a still life.
Maybe that's important about the materials as you're talking, because I'm thinking about, for me to kind of get out a piece of paper and an easel and paint, it raises all sorts of anxiety. But, to get some clay, or I love, your description of using a plant like that, the kind of destroying and random, just looking. And, one of the things I love my kids have taught me is junk modelling, using recycling and, taping it up and, sticking bits together, and how we can allow ourselves to be playful and kind to ourselves when we've got a bit of distance, I guess, from these memories or biases.
Absolutely. And I think, they're kind of using non-traditional materials and kind of recycled objects. It's brilliant, and it is freeing. And there are also things like collage, and you don't need to sort of be able to draw. And we work with patients who, in the hospital, or this is probably a bit off the topic actually, but who might be too weak to hold a pencil. And so it's like, well, what do you do if you don't have if you can't grip something? So you can still use art materials. You need to sort of think out of the box in terms of art or what it means.
Yes, and it makes me, think about health professionals who may also feel too weak to engage in a process, thinking about emotional exhaustion in particular, and how finding ways of meaningful self-expression, and particularly when it's hard to put things into words. And
yeah, so I think having that sort of gentle, indirect approach is really helpful, for that, because you're not necessarily, I suppose, you don't want to be kind of asking for something more from people who are already giving too much. And so it needs to be nourishing. They need to be getting something back. I mean, I still remember kind of the first ever session of that first series that we ran of art therapy workshops with doctors. One of the first drawings one of the doctors made was of a plate of food. And he was hungry. He hadn't eaten all day. But also, I guess, my sort of therapist-y mind afterwards, and I was thinking, yeah, they need nourishment. They want feeding. They're always feeding everyone else. They're always giving out. And here they've got these art materials kind of displayed like sweeties. It's like well, not sweeties, but it was like a table of food. These art materials, like, oh, for us. And like the glitter. I'm amazed, like, doctors love using glitter. It's like, oh, but it's just like, I'm not a huge fan of glitter, but I've realized it has its place kind of in these kinds of with this group, because it's like something shiny for me. It's like, and that's so important, I think.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please do share it with others, post about it on social media, or leave a rating and review. I'd love to connect with you, so do come and find me on LinkedIn or Twitter. You can also sign up to my mailing list to keep up to date with future episodes and get useful psychology advice and tips straight to your inbox. All the links are in the show notes. Thanks again, and until next time, take good care.